Hello, everybody. My name is Małgorzata Bakalash-Diverge, and I'm Director of Academic Programs at the Center for Jewish History. I'm happy to welcome you all today to our virtual space for a very special conversation. It looks like over the past few weeks, the community of Zoom regulars of our academic programs was established for good. I can see that the names are repeating, which is great. We're very grateful for your continuous interest and support. I still need to say what most of you know, that the Center for Jewish History is a home for archival collections of 5 partner institutions: YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, Leo Baeck Institute, American Jewish Historical Society, Yeshiva University Museum, and American Sephardi Federation. Together, these collections create the second largest archive of the Jewish experience in the world. You also know, it seems, that the center aspires to be an intellectual home for exchanges of ideas, scholarship, creative practice, and groundbreaking encounters that are inspired and informed by these archival collections. Our today's conversation marks the nearing end of Brian Ogren's tenure as the National Endowment for the Humanities Senior Scholar at the Center for Jewish History. That's his full title. I would like to thank you, Brian, for your presence in our academic community and for your mentorship and involvement with our graduate fellows and visiting scholars. Joining Brian will be Michael Hoberman, whose research and interests are in a very inspiring dialogue with Brian's. Let me super briefly introduce both speakers because I don't want to take a minute of the precious time that they will have for their conversation. Brian Ogren is an associate professor at Rice University. He specializes in Jewish thought and is particularly interested in philosophy and Kabbalah during the early modern period. His first monograph, entitled Renaissance and Rebirth, treats notions of reincarnation in Italian Renaissance Jewish and Christian humanist thought. His second monograph is entitled The Beginning of the World in Renaissance Jewish Thought, and discusses notions of creation in Italian Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah between 1492 and 1535. And we will hear from him in a minute about the recently finished manuscript, congratulations, of the projects he was working on during his stay at the center. Michael Hoberman is a professor of English studies at the Fitchburg State University. His most recent book on Jewish American literature and the sense of place, called 100 Acres of America, The Geography of Jewish American Literary History, was published in 2018. He also recently co-edited a primary source reader entitled Jews in the Americas, 1776 to 1826, with Laura Liebman and Hilit Surowitz Israel. Before I leave the stage to our discussants, I would like to remind 2 housekeeping things. First of all, you are all welcome to write down your questions. For the questions and answers portion of the talk, please use the Q&A function to do so. I will be collecting the questions and reading them to the discussants so that they don't get distracted. Secondly, our program is recorded and will be available via the Center's YouTube channel soon. And now, without further ado, Brian Ogren and Michael Hoberman.
Okay, so am I being heard right now? Can you hear me?
I hear you. I think we should assume they can hear you.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure those technical issues are out of the way. I didn't want to be halfway through my spiel and then be told that suddenly nobody heard what I had to say. So I thought that we would proceed. First of all, I want to thank the Center for Jewish History for being my host this year. And I want to especially thank Malgo for very much in a timely fashion getting everything going online and hosting these Zoom conversations and these Zoom presentations. She's done a phenomenal job of dealing with, the horrible situation that we happen to be in right now. I want to thank her also for really just giving me the time this year to work on my projects, and also the Center for Jewish History. It's been an interesting year, certainly. I remember my meeting with Malgo back in September at Bread's Bakery. I don't know if she remembers that. That was the first meeting that we had where we discussed expectations for the year. And I was excited about what was going on at the center, and I told her that my main desire amongst all of these wonderful things that are happening was to have the time and freedom to work on my research and writing, and Malgo has been incredibly obliging to this. The center before this pandemic hit was also a place that I could jump off to several of the Northeastern archives and libraries, and I had several small trips, and I found all kinds of interesting things, not only at the American Jewish Historical Society, which is part of the Center for Jewish History, but also in other places in Yale and in the American Antiquarian Society, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts, closer to where Michael is, and various other places. So I'm very grateful for that. And with the time and sort of the freedom to explore that was given to me, I was able to bring to fruition 2 projects, I'm glad to say. And this talk really serendipitously converges on the completion of both of these projects. So the first is an edited volume, which is actually directly related to what's going on here. And actually, Michael contributed to this volume on Kabbalah in America. I will just quickly do a screen share to let you know what we're talking about. Is that seen?
Not yet. Oh, now it is.
Okay, so this is a volume. I'm just putting this up there for visual effects. Anybody who's interested can look this up. It's a volume on Kabbalah in America coming out of a conference that we had at Rice University. Michael, again, participated in this. And the first section of this, I think actually the very first essay is Michael's essay, and then my essay is on Kabbalah in the colonial world, which is really the Jewish thought, more generally speaking, is the subject of our discussion today. So I imagine we will be able to get back to this at some point. And then the second project that I was able to bring to completion, actually, so that volume was just published a couple of days ago. That's how serendipitous this all is. That wasn't planned. It just happened to fall within the scheduling of this conversation. The second project is the completion of my book manuscript, which is tentatively titled Kabbalah and the Founding of America, Christian Uses of Jewish Thought in the Nascent Republic, which was also the topic of my project for this year, of course. For this project, I looked at a cluster of 5 important individuals, roughly from 1688, a little bit before 1685, we might say, until the 1780s, just after the Revolution. One of whom is the focal point for today's discussion, and that's a guy named Judah Monis. And how I thought we would proceed is I'll just introduce a little bit this figure, this fascinating figure named Judah Monis. I'll then turn it over to Michael. I'll introduce also why it is that I decided to ask Michael to join me within this conversation. And then I'll turn it over to Michael to see if he has anything to add just in terms of by way of introducing our fascinating figure. And then we have a couple of points that we thought it would be nice to discuss in terms of this figure and his significance for Judaism, his significance for American religious history, and so on and so forth. So, Judah Monis was born in Italy. It appears that he was born in 1683. Some say that he was born in the Barbary States in North Africa, though I have strong evidence that he was born in Livorno. I was able to uncover a ketubah, a marriage certificate that is between David and Rachel Monis. It's not, Judah isn't mentioned, but this marriage certificate was 3 years before he was born. We know that Monis is a very rare name. And so this is one piece of evidence that if these weren't his parents, then at least they were some type of relative that he had. And this was in Livorno. And the ketubah itself is signed off on by his rabbi, a guy named Jacob Sasportas, who was a very important Kabbalistic anti-Sabbatian. The Sabbatian movement, I won't get too deeply into it for today's conversation, but this was, for those who might not know, a messianic movement that spread like wildfire throughout the Jewish world in the 1660s. And of course, he ended up being a false Messiah because none of the prophecies of Messianism came true. He ended up converting to Islam. It's a fascinating story on its own. But Jacob Sasportas, Judah Monis' teacher, was one of the main anti-Sabbatian rabbis at the time. And Judah Monis seems to have imbibed some of this ideas of this messianism that worked into his own persona, into his own character. So Judah Monis was born in Italy. At some point, he made his way to New York. We don't know why. We don't know much about his early life. And actually, as Malgo said, in my earlier life, I was working on Italian Jewish thought, Italian Renaissance thought, the meeting point between humanism and Jewish thought. And so this was actually, believe it or not, I mean, I'm sure you can believe it, one of the reasons for my entrance into this whole American milieu, so to speak, that I was searching for any type of connection. And was there any connection between North America and Italy? And somehow I came upon this guy, Judah Monis, and I started researching a little more. I read Michael's wonderful book that came out in 2012 that has, right, 2012?
Yeah, 2011, 12, something like that, yeah.
Okay, so, and there are parts in there on Judah Monis. Judah Monis learned in yeshivot in Livorno and in Amsterdam. He was made what's called a maskil v'navon, which is an official title underneath the title of chacham. Now, in our terminology, what that means is he wasn't exactly he was a type of rabbi. This is another indication that he was Italian, because this was a very specific Italian type of designation, this idea of maskil v'navon. It's a title, like you would say maybe he had, if you were to translate it into academic terms, he had a BA or an MA maximum. He did not have a PhD. A chacham would be someone who's really an expert, really the top level. So he was one level under that, but he did seem to have training in a yeshiva setting. So he had a Jewish education. Like I said, at 32 years old, we find him. This is around 1715 in New York. And then Michael may have something to add to that whole period of his life. I don't know. I wasn't able to find much of anything.
Just the first few years, the 1716 information. Very little known. I mean, nobody knows why he went there, but we know that he arrived in 1716. That much is documented. And actually, there's a graduate student at CUNY right now, Israel Ben Porat, who maybe is listening to us right now, who's done a little bit of work on Monus in New York. And I was reviewing some of the things that I got from him. Monus was corresponding briefly with Samuel Johnson at King's College about Hebrew. This is before Monus ends up going to Cambridge. So that's a little bit of information about the time in New York, but that's all we know so far.
Okay. So yeah, it's very interesting. There are pieces of his life missing. In 1720, we find him in the Boston area. And what's fascinating is that he becomes the first Jew to receive an academic degree in America from Harvard. And this is for his Hebrew grammatical work, which is eventually published in 1735, the very first Hebrew grammar that's published in North America. So he's the first Jew to get an academic degree. He's the first person to publish a Hebrew grammar in the North American context. And then in 1722, he converts, and this is sort of where I pick him up. He converts to Congregational Christianity. He's under the tutelage of all kinds of important figures. This guy named Increase Mather, who was the erstwhile president of Harvard at the time. A guy named Benjamin Coleman, who is the famed minister of the famed Brattle Street Church. There's at attendance at his public baptism is the current president of Harvard, and it's a real big, wide public event. And shortly thereafter, he becomes the first full-time Hebrew instructor at Harvard. Benjamin Coleman, the famed minister, like I said, of Brattle Street Church, he writes an introduction to Monis's discourses, and there he describes him as follows. I'll just read. He writes, quote, "He is truly read and learned in the Jewish Kabbalah and rabbins, a master and critic in the Hebrew. He reads, speaks, writes, and interprets it with great readiness and accuracy, and is truly didactikos. He's apt to teach. His diligence and industry, together with his ability, is manifest unto many. To crown all, his knowledge of the Holy Scriptures, both Old and New Testament, is very happy and extraordinary, which he adorns with laudable conversation," end quote. So this is how he's being described by his Christian peers at the time. And this is part of the preface to his discourse that he writes subsequent to his baptism, which he is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? He titles it in a very almost comical manner, "The Truth, the Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth." And the third part of this, "Nothing But the Truth," is infused with Kabbalistic thought, which is where I very specifically pick up on him and where my focus lies in terms of analyzing his activity and analyzing what he's doing with Jewish thought and trying to integrate it into this whole American experiment. So that's a little bit about Judah Monis. Now, before I hand it over to Michael, if he has anything to add, I just want to say that I had read, this is how I invited Michael to join us here. I had read his book called New Israel, New England, right? I always get these backwards. New England, New Israel. It's, yeah, New England, New Israel. And I contacted him. I contacted you back in 2017 already. And because I had read your parts on Monus, I mean, I had read through the whole book, but specifically there were intriguing parts with Monus there. And I contacted you because I was going to be on a research trip in the Boston area. I was actually going to be using the AJHS, the American Jewish Historical Society collection that's housed now at the Genealogical Society in Boston, which was, at the time, it was sponsored by the Sid and Ruth Lapidus Fellowship. So I have another thing to thank the Center for Jewish History for really kicking off this project. And Michael very amicably agreed to meet. And I don't know if you remember, we met at Pete's Coffee off of Harvard Square.
You do.
And this was the beginning of our very fruitful conversation. And Michael's been a very wonderful conversation partner through this whole process. There are two quotes from New Israel, New England regarding Monus that specifically struck me as we were going along, and really what made me want to contact you. And you wrote there, I'm quoting on page 88, "At the deepest level, and as a powerful example of cultural liminality, Monus was neither a Jew nor a Christian, neither a father nor a son, neither a teacher nor a student." And then a little farther along, you state, The question whether Monus was a Jew or a Christian at heart, besides being an impossible one to answer, represents an epistemological dead end. What matters is why and how Monus's conversion, regardless of what his innermost spiritual leanings may have been, was important to third-generation Puritans. Jews, it is safe to say, are unlikely to have taken any notice of it. If they did, we have no record of what they thought. And so this was sort of what kicked off our relationship. With that, and we'll come back to these quotes, I'm pretty sure. We'll come back to the ideas in these quotes at least. And with that, and with a little bit of foreshadowing for our first point of conversation, which I'd like to be Monus and the question of identity and religious identity, American identity. Remember, he's this very, very strange, fascinating figure that we don't come across very often, that's between all kinds of worlds. And with that, I'll give it over to Michael, and if you have anything to add in terms of just introducing our figure here.
Sure. Well, first, let me just very quickly thank you, Brian, and the Center for Jewish History, but especially Brian, for inviting me to be part of your, what seems to be your culminating experience as the NEH fellow, so that I feel really honored that you asked me to do that. And I'll also, the book that Brian is referring to, New Israel, New England, I wrote as a result of a similar fellowship that I had at the Massachusetts Historical Society, 2008, 2009. So of course I never stop feeling grateful to the NEH and to the MHS for having made that possible. So I'll say just a little bit about that book very quickly, and then jump to the things some little bits and pieces I want to fill in about Monus. The book, New Israel, New England, was inspired by an event that occurred. Well, event is maybe a strong word for it, but I was doing an ethnography of Jews in rural New England at the turn of the 19th century, and I heard two different versions of the same story from, we're talking about people who were remembering stories that they heard about their late 19th, early 20th century Russian Jewish peddling grandparents. And the anecdote, one version in New Hampshire, one version in Massachusetts, was that some New England farm family invites the peddler into the house to buy what he has to sell. And then when they realize he's a Jew, they are so fascinated by his lineage, and they see that he's carrying a siddur with him. They ask him to read some of the Hebrew from his siddur. And so this story, which, I guess is recounting an event that might have taken place in 1910 or 1915 or something like that. Well, that's essentially the same role that Judah Monis played for New Englanders during the colonial era. He was the Jew in the land of the Puritan New Israelites. And what a strange convergence that is. So the book I ended up writing was an attempt to document several episodes and interactions among, beginning in the middle to late 17th century, right up to the time of the American Revolution, interactions between Puritan thinkers and ministers, their reading interactions, and on occasion their personal interactions with the Jews who crossed their paths or the Jews that they sought out. One point that I can't overemphasize, and I think, Brian, you've already kind of alluded to this, is mentioning that Jews I don't think Jews really cared very much about Judah Monis, if they noticed him at all. Well, essentially in writing New Israel, New England, what I discovered was that Puritans cared an awful lot about Jews, but Jews at best were probably largely indifferent to Puritans. And so that book was really an investigation of how Puritanism, with its many sort of internal crises and internal identity crises, looked to the Jewish legacy and to Jewish history for answers to insoluble problems, insoluble questions, including, I'll quote myself really quickly here, Puritans trying to understand how to achieve proper balances between individual piety and communal order, for instance, looked to Jewish history and to the examples of Jewish writers to try to inform these difficult times they were having, resolving their own problems. Anybody who has is the least bit versed in Puritan history is aware of a succession of crises, including the Antinomian crisis, where Anne Hutchinson is thrown out of Massachusetts and Roger Williams is evicted and so on. These are all kinds of problems Puritans couldn't work out among themselves, and sometimes they hoped that they could find the answers in Jewish texts and through interactions with modern living Jews. But back to Monis. My essential take on him in the book was, as Brian mentioned, that we'll learn not a whole lot about early Jewish American history from him, but we can certainly learn a lot about third generation Puritans. We're talking about a period, as Brian mentioned, from 1720, where he first shows up in Cambridge until his death, I think in 1764. Really, Monis was a foil to all manner of late stage Puritan problems, namely the waning of church influence, the waning of congregational authority, the burgeoning of a increasingly capitalist economy, and so on. For all kinds of reasons, the tight communal order that Puritans were seeking to create was felt, whether it was objectively speaking or not, it felt to people like Cotton Mather. This is the son of Increase Mather. For instance, it felt like these things were falling apart. And then all of a sudden, this Italian Jew shows up and he embodies this Hebraic heritage that a person like Cotton Mather could associate with the generation of the founders of New England, the John Winthrops, the John Cottons, and so on. Not only that, but he supplied, through his knowledge of Hebrew and his facility with Kabbalah and so on, he supplied a kind of a strange kind of orthodoxy that was dwindling out among Puritans of that period of time. I'll just say a couple other things about him, and then we can jump into our conversational points. One of the reasons I find, let me just go back for a second. Many of the people who've written about Monis, many people have written about him. And the question that very many scholars, I'm talking about going back to the turn of the 20th century, right up into the 1980s, the question was, well, did Monis really mean it when he converted? Did he really become a Christian, or was he secretly adhering to his Judaism inside? And as Brian quoted me, right, that's an epistemological dead end. That doesn't get us anywhere. But more important, it misses the point of Calvinist Christianity, because in Calvinism, the whole idea is that conversion is a lifelong process. You are not you don't become sanctified in Calvinism by virtue of a single statement or a single ceremony that you undergo. It's a lifelong process of introspection and confession and testimony and so on. And so the idea that a Jewish guy, or any person for that matter, could all of a sudden one day in a ceremony in a church move from the status of a damned Jew to a saved Christian, that's problematic to begin with. And so I think Monis is important because he sheds light on this dilemma within a waning Calvinism itself, where the conversion process is a sticky, complicated business. And so if there's doubt about Monis's conversion, it's really a projection of doubt that I would say 18th century latter-day Puritans had about their own faith. That's why Monis is so interesting. Last thing I want to mention about him, I don't know where this fits exactly, but when I was at the MHS, I found out through a sort of a casual survey of street indexes and so on, that Judah Monis was among the 10% of Cambridge residents in the 1740s through 60s who owned slaves. Neither here nor there, I'm not sure what to make of it, except that it does put him in a higher economic category than I would have thought a perpetually underpaid Harvard professor would have been in. I don't know what to do with that piece of information, but there it is. So Brian, I'm ready to continue on and talk about the identity question. That's where you wanted to go, right?
Yeah, although, I mean, there are a couple of points at risk of opening a bunch of can of worms here. I thought it might be interesting to
We're
follow
here. What we're doing, yes.
some of these lines. Yeah, so the fact that he owned slaves, like you said, I'm also not sure where that fits in terms of the grander narrative, but there are others who I wrote about in this present book that I just finished. One is this guy named George Keith, who was a very strange Quaker figure. He was a Scottish guy who made his way in 1685 to what was East Jersey at the time, now New Jersey, or at least what's part of New Jersey. And he was really one of the first people to write a tract that was published in North America that was anti-slavery, abolitionist. And there's a sense that part of his abolitionist sensibilities there were driven by his own theologies, which were influenced by Kabbalah. He had this sort of universalist approach to Kabbalah, which was very strange and unusual. And then we get, I mean, I guess you say, I did not know this before about that Judah Monis owned slaves. But then just in terms of the theological level, Judah Monis, as Michael knows very well, and maybe some others who are listening, had a great influence and impact upon a fellow named Ezra Stiles, who was the 7th president of Yale College. And Ezra Stiles, I mean, he marks in his notebooks and various other places that he had read Judah Monis's discourses. And he says he met him at one point. And this is what starts Ezra Stiles off on his own Kabbalistic explorations. And Ezra Stiles is an interesting person in this regard because he owned a slave in his earlier life. I think he named him Newport, if I'm not mistaken. And at some point he had some change of conscience and he freed this slave Newport. And he also wrote some anti-slavery abolitionist tracts. So, I mean, again, I'm just thinking out loud here with you, but you brought up the slavery issue. So, I mean, it's very fascinating how that fits into the whole wider picture here.
You know, Cotton Mather, well, it's not that he freed his slaves, but he wrote one of his, 300 plus publications. Cotton Mather wrote in favor of baptizing enslaved people and giving them a proper Christian education, which for him is quite a gesture. The reason I thought the slavery thing was relevant was simply in the sense that if you track Monus, and particularly through his career at Harvard, one of the paper trails he leaves is this is just a whole long list of letters that he sends to the Harvard, I don't know if it's the board of trustees or whoever is managing the pay scale there. And he's constantly harping on he's not getting paid enough. He can't manage this bill. Right. He can't manage this bill, and so on and so forth. And yet, again, to be a slave owner in Cambridge in 1745 or whatever was to be in the top 10% of the white residents of Cambridge. The other point, which I found to be, again, I'm not going to do it, but somebody maybe will write a novel. After they read your book and they read my book, they'll write a novel about Monus. The paper trail about the slaves comes about partly because one of Monus's chattels was due to marry a slave owned by President Holyoake of Harvard. So in other words, there's enough of a relationship between Monus and the president of Harvard, I think this is in 1747, to occasion the meeting of these two people, which apparently the marriage never took place. But anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Another point that you brought up was in this idea of that Jews didn't really care about Monus. This is an interesting point, and it's also an interesting point in terms of a jump off point for the question of identity. And I mean, certainly my sense is that there's no indication that Jews even knew about Monis. First of all, right, I mean, I certainly agree with your idea that Jews didn't care about him. But I think he wasn't writing for a Jewish audience. Otherwise, he would have been writing in either Hebrew or Ladino, probably. And I mean, here he's writing in English. His pamphlets are circulating, and this is what I'm talking about, these pamphlets, The Truth, the Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth, which the first one he seems to have given at his baptism, called The Truth. And then he added these latter two, The Whole Truth and Nothing But the Truth. There are 3 different discourses that he publishes, and they seem to have had a widespread dissemination in the Boston area. So the second point there, the first point is that, right, he doesn't write it in Hebrew or Ladino, he's writing it in English. The second point is that its distribution seems to be within this Cambridge, Boston area, and there are no Jews there at the time. We have to remember that Jews in British North America at the time were, I mean, you hear all different kinds of estimates. Jacob Rader Marcus has an estimate. I think it's 1/20% of the total population.
At the time of the revolution, I think maybe 2,000 to 2,500 total.
That's
for
what
all
they
of
say. Yeah, that's what. So I mean, the percentages were incredibly small, no matter how you look at it.
It's interesting though, because I mean, of course, you're right. We're both right that Jews are both oblivious to him, and if they weren't oblivious, they might be indifferent. But it's interesting that in those discourses, and you'll probably know where it shows up better than I can remember. He expresses a lot of. There's a certain portion of the discourse where he expresses a lot of emotional pain with regard to his brethren of the flesh. And I was rereading your chapter that you sent me, and you mentioned those portions too. In other words, there's something at stake for him. He's aware that he's cutting a vital tie in his life, and the length. Right. You know, there's portions of those discourses. I was also rereading my own chapter about it because I wrote it so long ago. There's portions of those discourses which are fairly sort of distant, almost clinical Protestant sermonizing. But then there are parts where it's almost like this this voice of this person is trying to get out of that distant voice, and it's mostly with regard to the deep affection that he still retains for his brethren of the flesh. And then, of course, he magnifies the legacy of his teachers, including Sesportus. He lays all these terms of endearment and honorifics upon him and other Jewish teachers. So he's clearly ready to let go of Judaism on a certain level, but pained, it seems, but pained by the loss at the same time.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of reading it. My reading was a little bit different, although it's, this is all interpretive because, as you've made the point in the past, that, this is all completely speculative because we really can't know what was going on in the mind of this figure. But my reading was that, he talks about the brethren of his brethren of the flesh, and he reaches out and he's addressing them in first person saying, "My brethren of the flesh, you're all in darkness, and come over to the light. And once you understand the true meaning of your own tradition," and this is where he brings Kabbalistic stuff in, and he says, if you really look at what the Shema says, for example, it's talking about the unity of God, and that's all great. But if you look at the Zohar, really, why does it say Shema Yisrael, Adonai, Eloheinu, Adonai? It mentions 3 times the name of God, and there's 3 in 1. That's the unity, that's the 3. If you understand through the prism of the Zohar, for example, of what the real meaning of this central pillar, the Shema, is to Israel, then you'll accept Protestant Christianity, and not only Protestant Christianity, but the Congregational American type of Christianity. My brethren of the flesh, please come and join me, and so on and so forth. And my sense was always that he was giving lip service, and that he was never intending, but again, this is trying to get into the mind of somebody who's been dead for how many hundreds of years now. I had a feeling also based on that there were these pastors like this guy, Robert Woodrow in Scotland, who was a big famous pastor who started a correspondence with Benjamin Coleman, who was sort of overseeing some of the conversion process of Monus. And he was saying, is he really sincere? If he's really sincere, I'll tell you how he can show he's really sincere. He can go and convert his brothers, right? Yeah. He can go and so my sense is maybe Coleman came to him. I mean, I have no evidence of this, right? But maybe Coleman came to him and said, I'll give you a hint. If you work some of that into your official discourse that gets published, that you're reaching out to your brethren of the flesh, then maybe this can have an impact in terms of how you're accepted into the wider Christian community. Well, I mean, again, I don't know. I'm speculating here.
It's remarkable in general how often when a figure like Monus, or I'll mention Cotton Mather in a moment, will be ostensibly writing for somebody else, but in fact is performing for an inside audience. So as you're saying, in this case, Monus is essentially performing maybe what Coleman put him up to do. And for Mather's part, Cotton Mather, that is, wrote, I think, 2 or 3 conversion pamphlets in his time. Pamphlets whose ostensible purpose was to convert Jews to Protestant Christianity. But it's clear from the start, if you pick up any one of these pamphlets, that these pamphlets are essentially intended for Protestant audiences. The Jews who are supposed to read them, first of all, very few of them speak English. Very few of them have access to them, are going to even come by them. They're more often performances on Mather's part where he's talking to Jews as a way of talking to his fellow Protestants. And in the spirit of the Jeremiad almost, calling Protestants to their own failures, to their own shortcomings. And the mode for this performance is a pamphlet intended for potential Jewish converts.
Yeah. Right. And Monus ends up being really sort of a paradigmatic example of this, certainly for Increase Mather, that, right, for him, this is shortly before his death. I think he's 81 he's 81 at the time. He's at the time of Judah Monis's actual conversion, he's too ill to actually come and participate in the baptism ceremony. But he ends up writing a preface for his discourses. He seems to be behind the scenes along with Benjamin Coleman and some of these others. And for him, this seems to be sort of the culminating point of his life. The culminating point of these, like Michael was saying, these 3 tracts that he writes concerning the conversion, the national conversion of the Jews. Now he has it in the flesh. Now there's suddenly a specific concrete character that he can pin all of his hopes, his eschatological hopes, his hopes for the ends of times, his hopes for the second coming of Christ, for the conversion, the national conversion of the Jews. It's going to begin with this character Monus, and it's going to spread out from there. And it's, so it's sort of almost his dying wish comes true in some way through this figure of Monus.
I think it's certainly the case that for the Increase Mather generation, there was that hope. I think once you get to the time of Monus, most rationally thinking, Latter-day Puritan ministers had given up on any idea of a national conversion. And again, I think the best hope that Monus, I think this is something I said in the book, that what they were really hoping Monus would do would be to just get a bunch of lazy Harvard undergraduates to learn their Hebrew and get to be a little bit more conventionally pious in according to the model of the founders of New England. It's not clear. I mean, yeah, it's. I think Increase Mather still he's of the generation where they were still looking to that to happen. And as you talk about the Sabbatean controversy and so on, that's within Increase Mather's memory banks. He can see the Jews making their pilgrimage to Jerusalem and so on. That's still a reality for him. I'm not so sure for the the younger Harvard authorities during the time of Monis's professorship there, if they still had such high hopes at that point.
Really? I'm not
well
sure.
I'm just I don't yeah.
I mean, if you look at moving forward, if you look at, for example, Ezra Stiles, he comes back to a lot of these tropes. He comes back to these ideas that the new Jerusalem will be, at the end of times, the new Jerusalem will be the heavenly Jerusalem that descends upon the earthly Zion, and that the Jews as a nation will eventually go and inhabit this space, and Jews converted as a nation to Christianity. And then so you get this sort of dual chosenness in some way. That, I mean, it's so, even for Ezra Stiles, so we're talking about Ezra Stiles in the 1770s.
Mm-hmm.
And he's definitely, he may be an outlier in this, but he's certainly propagating this idea that he's not interested necessarily in actively converting the Jews in the same sense that Increase Mather is, for sure. But he has this vision of the end where there's going to be this reestablished Zion, and the Jews are going to go and re-inhabit this reestablished Zion on earth, this heavenly Zion on the earth, upon the earthly Jerusalem. It's for him in his generation already, but he's borrowing from this whole Monus episode. He's borrowing from Increase Mather, certainly. But he does, I mean, he certainly, I think, you can say he's changing the narrative in some way, that he also sees, Michael talked about conversion, and that conversion is this constant process. He's changing the narrative in a way where he also sees sort of a conversion of Christianity itself. And I'm talking about Ezra Stiles here. And Ezra Stiles certainly has this idea of going back to this sort of, what do I phrase it to? I'm borrowing from Alison Coder here, has a term, she calls it apostolic, what was it? So she calls it an apostolic Jewish Christianity. And there she's talking about this group of Kabbalists coming out of Sulzbach, which prints the Zohar that Ezra Stiles eventually has in his possession, that has an influence upon certainly Ezra Stiles, but even before, some of the figures before Ezra Stiles. So this idea of an apostolic Jewish Christianity, it's an idea of stripping away what Catholicism has distorted throughout the ages, going back to what the original apostles, how they viewed Christianity, how they were at the time of Christ. And the idea there is that there are Kabbalistic Jewish elements, secret traditions that were handed down to Moses that actually point to the truth of the Trinity and so on and so forth. And so this is, I mean, Ezra Stiles sees that working into the whole process of Christianity being converted in some way or transformed but then also somehow the pinnacle of this, the eschaton, taking place in a rebuilt Jerusalem.
It's hard to know on the, you know, when you get to Stiles, you're talking about a guy who's in Newport, surrounded by, well, not surrounded by, but certainly within short walking distance of a synagogue and of Jews that he interacts with.
That's true. Right?
And the merchants of Newport probably did not furnish, they were not the people he was, you know, he got along perfectly well with them. He had some nice relationships with those people, but, you know, I don't think he was expecting Aaron Lopez to lead this movement to bring about the eschaton, that's for sure. So it's interesting where the hopes of these Stileses and these Mathers run against the reality of you know, a changing world and a transatlantic economy where the Jews that you see are they're very Jewish, but their eyes are not fixed on the eschaton, that's for sure.
No, you're absolutely right. It's I would say he's certainly, so in just a little bit of background on this guy, Ezra Stiles, right? He's the minister, he's a congregational minister, like Michael was saying, in Newport, Rhode Island at the time. Newport has this vibrant Jewish community, and he starts to get interested in all of these Jewish ways. And he starts to get interested in learning the proper pronunciation of Hebrew. So he starts going to the synagogue to learn from the Chazan. And he starts getting interested in Jewish texts and Jewish liturgy. And eventually he becomes interested in Kabbalistic stuff. And he starts meeting with all of these shlichim, all of these people coming from, or shadarim, people who are coming through, what would we call them, emissaries that are coming through, and he starts learning from them, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I would totally agree that he doesn't see some type of messianic end of time coming through someone like an Aaron Lopez figure, or even for that matter from someone like Karigal, who is one of these emissaries that's coming through town. But he is reading Monus, and he's reading into the Monus narrative and the Monus story, and I think he's seeing this as the beginning of some type of end here.
Yeah,
and he's holding Monus in this sort of liminal position, like you say, the way you frame Monus, that Monus, you said, I mean, I'll just come back to this, I know we're sort of closing in on time here, but in your book, the part that I quoted here, where you
not being
said,
a father, not a son, not a Christian, not a Jew.
Yeah, that part where you said he was neither a Jew nor a Christian, neither a father nor a son, that he was a liminal figure, right? Neither a teacher nor a student. I would agree to that. I largely agree, but I would add, and I would say that he was both. He was both a Jew and a Christian. He was both a father and a son, at least metaphorically speaking. I don't know if he had children. But he was both a teacher and a student. And he, you know, so he, yeah.
I was just going to say, if we can, I want to make sure to bring up one of your themes, which is that the setting of North America is very essential here, and that the liminality of Monus and the liminality of this situation, this neither Christian nor Jewish, is specific for these people to the fact that this is all happening against the backdrop of the New World, and you know, that somehow the New World is a new kind of place where you can have a Jewish Christian or a Christian Jew by virtue of its existence outside of, you know, as people framed it, as outside of ordinary history.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I've been reading through this. You brought my attention to this this latest book on the on Winthrop, and this whole this idea of a city on a hill, and so on and so forth, and this idea of American exceptionalism and such. it's very interesting. It's there's a guy named Avihu Zakai. I don't know if you're familiar with his.
Come across this stuff before.
So he's got an interesting take that this whole idea of the errand into the wilderness, this idea that the original Puritans, were making a concerted effort in their journey to the New World. And there was some type of divine sanction for this, and there's all kinds of questions what this errand means, whether this errand was some type of, a presaging of manifest destiny and these ideas of the greatness of America and being a light to the world and so on and so forth. And so Avihu Zakai, he has this reading where he says the focus has been on this idea of errand, but we should also be looking at this idea of wilderness. And what does wilderness mean? And there's this idea of the typology built into the Exodus narrative, for example, where the wilderness is a spot that's before the promised land. It's not the promised land.
Well, I'll throw this one little thing in to that. Earlier today, I mentioned to you the Ezra Stiles, the sermon from 1783, United States Elevated to Glory and Honor, which he delivers at the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, where he draws all kinds of comparisons between the United States, he names it the United States of America, and ancient Israel, God's American Israel, including, I thought this was interesting, that at the time of the assembly at Sinai, there were 3 million people there, and that was the population of the United States at the conclusion of the American Revolution. Therefore, the United States is a parallel case to ancient Israel. This is Stiles in 1783.
Yeah. That's definitely pertinent, I think, to what's going on here. I don't know how it ties back directly to the Monus material.
Well, it's the wilderness idea that you brought up a moment ago, and that the idea of the Americas as a liminal space where where there's some new form of, I guess, for Stiles and the Mathers and so on, some new form of Protestant Christianity, which bridges the gap between the modern world and the ancient world.
Yeah, I actually write about this in the conclusion of my book, and there's a part here that might be worth quoting in full from that sermon that you're talking about from 1783, or that address that he gives, where he says, the Great American Revolution, this recent political phenomenon of a new sovereignty arising among the sovereign powers of the earth, will be attended to and contemplated by all nations. Navigation will carry the American flag around the globe itself and display the 13 stripes and new constellation at Bengal and Canton, on the Indus and the Ganges, on the Wangho and the Yangtze Kiang. And with commerce will import the wisdom and literature of the East. That prophecy of Daniel is now literally fulfilling, and he says there should be a universal traveling to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased, and this knowledge will be brought home and treasured up in America. And being here, it will be digested and carried to the highest perfection. It may reblaze back from America to Europe, Asia, and Africa, and illumine the whole world with truth and liberty. So yeah, he's definitely got something going on there with this idea of American exceptionalism. He's already transformed this idea into some notion that America is going to bring the light and wisdom to the rest of the world. What's interesting here is he adds this idea that knowledge from the East is going to come back come back to the American continent. It's going to be reformulated and made even better, and then go back out to enlighten the world in some way. But
I guess the salient point, again, maybe not so much in that, but in so much of what you've said before today is this curious hybrid of a Judaically informed Protestantism is the vehicle that through which America is going to establish this pattern, which is why these Monises are so important.
Indeed, yes.
And there's Malgo. There must be a reason she's here.
Indeed, I really was very inspired by the notion of America as a liminal space, because it got a new familiarity from a completely different context that is outside of this conversation. But I thought it perhaps could be a good moment for us to take some questions. And, you know, within the process of answering these questions, and perhaps after that process, you can continue some of the points that may arise. So let me read some of them to you. You can, of course, have them in front of you in the Q&A section, but I take it upon myself to read it to our speakers. So let's start from the beginning. To Dr. Ogren, what was the most interesting, surprising, enlightening collection of materials you viewed at the Center for Jewish History?
Okay, that's interesting. So there is actually the picture that you saw that Malgo so nicely put up for as the advertisement for this talk was this is a grammar that was copied out. Let me just get this up here. This was from 1724, a guy named William Metcalf, who was in Monis's class. He was one of his Hebrew students at Harvard. And he, before the grammar was published in 1935, what Monis would do is he would have all of his students copy out this Hebrew grammar by hand in order to have a copy for themselves. I don't know if there was a didactic element there as well, that, you know, I guess if you copy something, maybe it commits it to memory. But certainly, I mean, they didn't have the printing capabilities, so he would have everyone copy out. And this guy, William Metcalf, he has a copy from 1724 that's in the collection of the Hebrew grammar there. And within that grammar, there's a unique list of theological questions. Questions and answers at the end that's not in any of the other grammars. And it's in both in English and it's in a somewhat stilted Hebrew. So I don't know if he's getting this Hebrew from Monus or if he's trying to do his own Hebrew, the student. And the first question there, for example, he asks, quote, "What is the chief end of man?" And then the answer is, "The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever." And then he goes on. The fourth question asks, "What is God?" And the answer is, "God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, infinite goodness, and truth." And then the final question there, he says, "Are there more gods than one?" And the answer there, he says, "There is but one only, the living and true God." It's pretty remarkable. It goes along with, for example, I brought up the issue of the Shema before, this idea of the oneness of God, where he's utilizing it in his discourse in order to try to prove the Trinity of Christianity. But here he seems to be bringing this same type of Shema theology of unity to his students in a much more Jewish manner. So, I mean, what's interesting here with this manuscript that we find in the collection is that we see not only was he a Hebrew teacher, he was also bringing forth theology to his students, or so it seems. And I mean, so his role went beyond just being a mere language teacher. And he seems to have been instilling them with really Judaic type of theology here.
That sounds like that's a precious document, Brian. That the hand-copied version that I viewed at the MHS years ago doesn't convey anything like that. All it conveys is a bunch of doodles in the margins. that would suggest that this particular student was not paying attention in class.
So maybe William Metcalf was a better student.
Yeah, it sounds like at the very least Metcalf.
We all have we all have those types of.
Yeah.
There's that one manuscript, I don't remember where it is, where the guy writes Judah Monis, M.A., and then he maker of asses, right? Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you found that.
So at least one student was listening to him, or.
Okay, the next question is about the name of Judah Monis. Why did you say that his last name was rare? Because the name of the person who is asking the question is Moniz, but with the Russian or Pale settlement background via the father's side. So he's wondering why Moniz is a rare name.
Okay, well, I mean, so
I only have to go the George Alexander Kohut article, which claims it to be a rare name, but I don't have enough background in Italian Jewish history to know.
Well, so the George Alexander Kohut makes the case for it being a rare name, and also George Foot Moore makes the case for it being a rare name. It seems to be not Russian in its derivative, but if anything, North African, because we know his family was of North African descent. We know he's coming from a North African line. So that's where the confusion also comes in terms of him being from the Barbary States or Algeria or wherever else it may have been in North Africa that his family originally derived from. We know that also apparently from the name, which is a name coming from that area, but it's rare. Again, I just like Michael, I don't know the full history of that. I'm drawing also from George Alexander Kohut and from George Foot Moore. And then also he has a huge manuscript that's now housed at Harvard, which is partly in his own handwriting. It's a Hebrew manuscript. It's a bunch of Kabbalistic texts. And the parts that are in his own handwriting it's North African script. So, I mean, we're pretty sure that's where his family came from, at least. And a lot of the people who were in Livorno at the time were coming from North Africa in any case. So it's not that strange. But so I don't think there's a Russian connection with the name. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if Michael has any more to add to that.
No, I'm just going by those two articles that you were, but you found the ketubah, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah, that's a remarkable find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, I don't know if it was his parents, but it's likely that it was at least some relative.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next question. How common was it for Italian Jews to migrate to the New World at the time?
I don't think it was particularly common at all. I mean, it wasn't common for any Jews to migrate to the New World. Let's start there. But the overview is that really 17th century through the 18th century, first you have a sort of a relatively large contingent of Sephardim people, Portuguese Jews, and then conversos, hidden Jews leaving from various parts of Southern Europe, some of whom I suppose might have been in Italy for a brief period of time. But I'm not aware of a large Italian contingent.
I'm not either.
Contingent. So it adds more to the mystery of Monus.
My sense is that if I had to guess, which is all I can do at this point is guess unless somebody comes up with more documentation, is that he first made his way to Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. And then from Amsterdam, I think there's evidence that he was in London at a certain point.
Well, there was a lot of movement from between Amsterdam and London on the part of these Sephardim.
And then from there, it's not that unusual that from the jumping off point of Amsterdam and then certainly London, it's not that unusual that he would make his way to to the New World.
Mhm.
But yeah, Italian Jews as a group, there's not much
Mhm.
in terms of immigration going on. That's one of the things that sort of opened me up to this whole project. I was looking for some connection and I found this guy and I thought, wow, what if I follow this? And then I fell down the rabbit hole and ended up where I am now. Yeah.
Pretty good rabbit hole to be at. Next question. What Jewish texts did the Puritans consult as they tried to work out the conflicts? Were there non-biblical periods that they were particularly drawn to?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, I know Brian will be able to speak to the Kabbalistic material, so I'll let you talk about that. But the Jewish texts, I mean, typically for 17th century New England ministers, a lot, immersed in the 5 books of Moses, really. So, for instance, Massachusetts, in Massachusetts Bay, there was an attempt to create a legal a binding set of Massachusetts laws that they commissioned John Cotton to put together. You can look at versions of it, I think, in the Massachusetts State Archives. And Cotton had an idea of basically extracting every single law for Massachusetts from the 5 books of Moses. And so every law in this document, there's a law indicated on the left-hand side, and then you're given the exact biblical origin of it, from whether it's from Exodus or Genesis or wherever. Now, John Cotton was overruled in that, and they decided that they weren't going to stone people to death for breaking the Sabbath. They had other ways to humiliate them besides that. But those are the typically it was the Hebrew Bible that was looked to. But then also when you have a person like, again, Cotton Mather, and then later figures like Ezra Stiles, as we've been talking about, right up into the 19th century, Hannah Adams, there were New Englanders who were interested in post-biblical Jewish history, and they typically read books by European Christian historians like this guy Jacques Banage, and people who had undertaken to tell the story of the Jews from the Bible onward. They looked at Josephus. That was considered to be a Jewish text. But I'll leave it there because I know there's much more that Brian can speak to as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of which Puritan, if you're talking specifically about Puritans, certainly, it's a question, as always, with these types of groups, of which ones you're talking about. Someone like Cotton Mather, who Michael mentioned, was very prideful of being part of the Republic of Letters. He was reading everything and he was copying from everywhere. And he, like Michael said, was reading Jacques Banage, who was a Protestant thinker and historian coming out of France. He's reading the Buxtorfs, Johann Buxtorf the Elder and Johann Buxtorf the Younger, who are, again, Protestant. Most of what I found, which is interesting, is most of his sources can be traced back to specifically Protestant thinkers, and Protestant Hebraists also. And so he's reading all of these different sources and he's drawing on them. And they're mentioning things like the Zohar. They're mentioning things like Maimonides. They're mentioning, all of these post-biblical, even medieval, and some early modern texts. And, so he's reading all of this and he's drawing material from there. Judah Monis, of course, as a liminal figure, is a little bit different. And of course, like I said, he has a yeshiva background and he's reading some of the original Hebraic sources and he's trying to make it fit into this whole sort of Puritan narrative. If you talk about some of the post-Puritan, I mean, I don't technically, right, someone like Ezra Stiles, he's an heir of the Puritan lineage. He's not necessarily a Puritan himself, but he's a little more open to, like, he starts meeting with these different rabbis and he starts reading specific texts. He's getting firsthand, he orders a copy of the Zohar And incidentally, if anybody finds this, this was one of the, if anybody who's out there listening, I see there are 40 participants. On April 11th, 2017, I was looking back at my emails with Michael, and one of the first questions I had for you, I said, George Footmore mentions a copy of the Zohar that he came across in the libraries of Harvard, which apparently belonged to Ezra Stiles. And, right, it was the Sulzbach edition of 1684. In a search through Hollis, nothing comes up. This was back in 2017. And I asked, are you aware of this or have you seen it? And I think your answer was no. And then since then, I've been to Harvard. I've gone through their archives. I've gone through all of their copies of the Zohar. I've been in contact with the librarians at Yale. I've gone through Beinecke, all of the copies of the Zohar that they have there. And this thing is completely lost. And so someone like Ezra Stiles, he was reading the Zohar. He was taking notes in the Zohar. He was reading Sefer Yetzirah, which is another Hebrew mystical text. He was taking notes from that. So he was tapped into some of the original Hebrew and Aramaic sources, but he was reading Monus. He lists Monus as one of his sources.
And we also know that Stiles attended a sermon by Chaim Karagel in New York. The first published Jewish sermon in North America. Stiles was there, although how he could have understood the sermon, which I assume was delivered in Portuguese, I don't know, but he claimed that he followed along.
Yeah.
He had enough.
Well, it was translated shortly afterwards. He actually, Stiles, I think, helped pay for somebody commissioned a translated version of it.
It was translated, and a big portion of the translation is in his notebooks.
Yeah.
But it's identical with the translation that ended up getting published. So I imagine he either had a pre-copy of it or I don't know what. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But eventually he was able to at least read the translation. I don't know how much he understood actually sitting there, right?
Maybe he wanted the spirit,
Right.
Next question. Obviously, without evidence, it can only be speculation. But a higher economic status makes me think that Judah Monis came as a merchant. How likely is that? I imagine the majority of Jews in the New World came as merchants. Is that accurate?
Oh, that's definitely accurate. If they were either successful merchants or unsuccessful merchants, but they were all merchants of some kind or another. Right. It's not clear that Monus was a successful merchant, which is why he decided to become a professor. Well, that's not why, but it may be one reason why he decided to become a professor instead of a merchant. But yes, when he's admitted to, the document is so far from me right now, but when he was admitted to New York in 1716, it's on the basis of that he's going to be trading in New York. But I don't know anything more than that. And certainly being a merchant is not a guarantee of high economic status, because there were plenty of these people who didn't make it successfully at all.
Yeah. Nobody at that time, nobody from the Jewish world at that time came to the American continent. Well, I should say came to the North American continent as a scholar of Judaism or as looking to further their scholarship of Judaism. There were no yeshivot in the world at the time. There were no ordained rabbis until 1840 when Abraham Rice set foot on the continent. So that wouldn't have been his goal in coming to the New World, certainly.
But he may have had, as you alluded earlier, Brian, with regard to that mysterious book and the handwriting that you can't make out the origin. It's possible that he had an idea in his mind of being a grammarian, of being, applying his trade as a Hebrew grammarian. Maybe he got that idea before he came here. It's possible, right?
Possible,
And if
yeah.
that's true, that would make him the exception to the rule, because you're right. We don't know of anyone having come here for anything other than to buy and sell things.
Thank you. To Michael's point about Monis' pain over his Jewish brethren, it sounds a little like St. Paul. Did Monis feel a particular affinity with Paul?
I'm not enough of a Pauline scholar I'm not sure I could answer very confidently about that. Nothing that stands out to me from those discourses would suggest that. Brian, do you have some sense of that?
Yeah, I did write something about that. I'm trying to remember now and I'm drawing a blank, but I did write about that Pauline connection. It's, well, if my book ever gets published in a year or so, I suggest you go look it up there, because I'm so sorry I'm drawing a blank. But I did make that Pauline connection.
Well, one of our listeners just put on the chat that the gravestone contains a Pauline reference, which I'll have to take a look at my footnote there to see what that is. But I don't know if that's what you had in mind, Brian. If it was the gravestone.
No, it wasn't. It was about his reaching out to his brethren of the flesh and such. It was specifically that, yeah.
The term, by the way, brethren of the flesh is I'm finding it to be, it's quite common in this period for early American writers. A place that I've encountered it is in a completely different context, is in the work of a Native American Christian minister, Samson Occam, who also addresses his brethren of the flesh, who happen to be his fellow Pequots. So there is an idea of sort of biological lineage on the one hand, and Protestant belief, and the ways in which those two things sort of sometimes are at odds with each other. But maybe we should go to the next question.
With pleasure. I wasn't sure if you're still looking for the reference. Or
I'll take a look.
I'm trying to look it up, but it's
okay. So the next question is actually by Israel Ben Pohat, the graduate student whom Michael mentioned.
Hi, Israel.
In the conversation.
I thought you'd be there. I'm glad you are.
He's asking the following. I was wondering, Brian, if you could elaborate on Moniz' connection between Trinitarianism and Kabbalah. How did he use the latter to substantiate the former?
How did he use the latter, meaning how did he use Kabbalah?
Trinitarianism and Kabbalah. How did he use probably Kabbalah to substantiate Trinitarianism?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting story. He's drawing on like I said, he's drawing on certain Zoharic texts that specifically talk about the Trinity and the Shema, for example. He's very big into that, this idea that the three mentions of the name of God point to a unity in the one. He's drawing on, he mistakenly attributes to Sefer Yetzirah, but he's actually drawing on a figure named Bachya ben Asher, and Bachya is drawing on various other previous sources where it talks about the three tzachtzechot, these types of light, this bright illuminating light that are supernal and sort of above the divine structure. Of course, you can see this idea of three works into this idea of a Trinitarian. There's in fact, if you look in Kabbalah and Kabbalistic literature, there's Trinitarianism everywhere. Now, that doesn't mean that Kabbalah is Christian. I want to be clear about that. And this isn't anything necessarily new to Monus himself. There are Christian Kabbalists who are doing this stuff already in the 15th, 16th century. There's even before this, certain Christian Hebraists who are drawing these parallels. But it's, what I mean by that is, you get this structure of like, I don't want to go into the whole big theory, but there's this structure of the 10 Sefirot. These are these 10 divine potencies that are sort of a hallmark of Kabbalah, and they're divided into 3 columns. They're divided in a way that there's the 3 upper and the 7 lower. And of course, Christian Kabbalists or anybody who's reading these things trying to look for a pattern of Trinity and say, oh, well, look, it shows the truth of Christianity. Well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't do so any more than, for example, looking at, if anybody's familiar with the philosophy of Plotinus, is also very Trinitarian. Plotinus was very much anti-Christian. But Plotinus has this idea, of the one, the soul, the intellect, that there are 3 emanations. There's a Trinitarianism there. By very definition, Trinitarian just only means a tripart structure of anything. So Christians come along and they try to fit that into the pattern. But right, if you look into Kabbalistic literature, it's all over the place. You can find Trinitarianism everywhere. Monus just happens to take it a step further and say, oh, this is proof of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
So it's like when somebody buys a VW, they see VWs all over the road. The Christian Kabbalists see 3, and they assume that it means the Christian Trinity.
I mean, it must, right? Why else would the Shema mention God's name 3 times? It's... Mm-hmm. What point would there be in mentioning God's name 3 times in a prayer about unity, unless it's talking about the Trinity?
Mm-hmm.
This isn't my idea, by the way. I'm just, just to be clear, it's so that I don't get any hate mail or something. But yeah,
there's some very helpful chat information from Eric Braverman about the tombstone. And the Pauline reference has to do with the grafting of the tree, which is taken from Romans. I mean, on the stone itself, you can see where that line comes from. It's attributed to Romans. So anyone can open the chat and get Eric Braverman's response to that. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And we will continue with the questions. So Israel is also asking, I also noticed that both of you seem to be using the terms Puritan, Protestant, and Calvinist interchangeably. And I'm wondering how important these terms are and the distinctions between them for understanding how Moniz intersected with Christian thought. That was actually my question too.
Okay, so the 3 terms are Puritan, Protestant, and Calvinist?
Yes.
Well, they are very important. For sure, and I will admit to having used them interchangeably, maybe somewhat blithely, but the Calvinist aspect has to do with predestination specifically, and going back to the remarks with which I began, having to do with Monis's conversion being questionable on the basis of, because Calvinism itself, predestinarianism, doesn't assume that a conversion is just something that happens in one moment. You're all of a sudden converted convincingly. So that's why that term is important. I think Puritan is maybe the most problematic of all of these terms, because, well, if nothing else, it's like so many terms, the origins of it are with the people who didn't like the Puritans and decided to call them Puritans because they were different from them. But Puritan in my book refers really to the offspring of the English Civil War and the rebellion against the king during that period of time. So really the term becomes obsolete when you get to the late 17th century, because it's just no longer operative, really, because that political situation is at least after the Glorious Revolution of 1689 is no longer relevant, I guess. Protestant is just a catch-all term, right, for anything non-Catholic, non-Greek Orthodox, particularly in this early modern context. We're talking about a Northern European movement that some people have written, recent scholars have written about. There's a great book I was rereading parts of earlier today by Thomas Kidd called The Protestant Interest. And Protestantism is interesting because, to me anyway, it's a term that refers not just to the religious movement, but to a much larger sort of almost a political movement and an amalgamation of religious factions within different Northern European societies that were trying to assemble a certain amount of political power and economic power in the Mediterranean and Atlantic world. So I think Protestant is useful if you want to bridge the gap between religion and economics and politics.
Mm-hmm. Was Moniz
Yeah.
engaging specifically with different denominations within Protestantism, or was it just Christianity for him, and by this he meant really Protestantism?
Well, I think I'll ask Brian to speak more to it, but as Brian mentioned at the beginning, Moniz converted to what we call Congregational Christianity, which was the New England, the sort of the dominant version of Protestantism in New England during his period of time in the mid-18th century. But maybe you want to break that down further?
Well, yeah, so Monus is interesting in this case. Michael and I have talked about this in the past because he is bringing up all kinds of in his discourses, he's bringing up all kinds of theological questions and divides that are happening at the time that he would probably, as some Pintele Yid, some Jew coming from the European continent and then coming into New York and then ending up in Boston, probably wouldn't have known that much about, but that he was groomed into these. For example, a question of Arianism, which is, these are all complex questions, again, reverting back to the idea of the Trinity that are going on in the Protestant world at the time, that, do we see Jesus as wholly human or wholly divine or both, those types of things? Do we take God as a Trinity? Is he really 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, or do we go more towards what then eventually becomes the Unitarian vision of really there's this one God? And all of these types of debates that are going on in the Protestant world at the time, Monus addresses some of these things in his discourse. And so scholars of the past have said, well, he couldn't have written this thing. There must have been a hand behind the scenes. My impression is that, again, this is all speculative and it's a little bit of guesswork, that he certainly had help. He certainly had people like the people we mentioned, Increase Mather and Benjamin Coleman, and perhaps various others behind the scenes.
He had help with the English, if nothing else.
He certainly had help with the English, but I think he also had help in terms of casting and crafting this theology and the theological arguments there. And so he does address these types of issues. He's, of course, very much a Congregationalist Christian, because that's what his milieu is at the time. That's what he wants to take upon himself. So he does get involved in this. Of course, one of the areas that we didn't get into was also he's very anti-Catholic, as they all are at the time. Catholicism, the Pope in Rome is the Antichrist. It's not Judaism. The Jews are just mistaken. But once they see the light, they'll be fine. But right. The Pope really is the Antichrist.
Well, I was mentioning to Brian a few days ago that in I think it's in the Rhode Island Charter, or in one of the drafts of the Rhode Island Charter, where Roger Williams talks about allowing, Jews, infidels, Turks means Muslims, basically anybody is allowed into Rhode Island. And then there's the final category of anti-Christians. The term anti-Christian means Catholic. So Rhode Island was so rogue that they were willing to let Catholics in. And Catholicism is really it's the enemy at the margins. That's why there was so much military fuss around the Canadian border during this period of time. It's all about the incursion of the Pope, or the fear of an incursion by Catholic forces. And again, it's a religious issue, but it also extends to questions of economic and political power too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay.
I did find my reference to Paul, by the way, that just really briefly in Increase Mather in 1709 in his dissertation concerning the future conversion of the Jewish nation, that's the name of his treatise, he says, I am inclined to think that it will be affected, the conversion of the Jews, it will be affected as Paul's was, by a miraculous appearance of Christ to some of them, and then be carried on by the preaching of the gospel with a most glorious downpouring of the Holy Spirit therewith. So he's saying it will be like the Pauline conversion. It will appear to one or to a few of the Jews, and then they will preach forth the gospel and bring it to the world. And I think my sensibility, or my interpretation at least, is that he sees Monus playing this type of role. I don't know what Monus saw of himself, but Mather seems to see him in this Pauline light. So that's to answer that question from way back when.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we have a long question ahead of us from Noam Siena, a two-part question for Michael or Brian. As a scholar of North African Jewish history, I'm particularly interested in Monis's connection to the Barbary states. You mentioned a ketubah from Livorno, possibly of his parents, signed by his teacher. As you may well know, Livorno was a major center of North African Jewish settlement. And of course, Sasportas himself was also North African. So first, I'm wondering if there are any other indications that Moniz was from a North African family, even if born in Italy. And if so, whether we can see any continuities or legacies of the specific lineage of Sephardi North African Kabbalah in terms of text, teachers, writings in his work. Second, is the North African Barbary Oriental heritage, real or imagined, played into how he was perceived by the Puritan Americans around him?
So, I guess I can start with this. So first of all, as I mentioned, right, in his Kabbalistic manuscripts that are written in Hebrew, that which was determined by librarians and codicologists. I haven't done this work myself because I'm not equipped to do so, but apparently those who have determined that the parts that are in his own handwriting, apparently this is North African script. And I've actually verified that the script itself is indeed North African script, which is a little bit different than other types of, like if you would find something written by an Ashkenazi person in Hebrew, it would have a different type of Hebrew script. So that's one indication. Another is in the New England Current, where there was an announcement of his conversion, of his baptism. I think it states something about him being, I think Michael maybe can correct me on this, it states something about him being from Algeria or of Algerian lineage or something to that effect. So that's one contemporary account that we have of that. And then beyond that, I don't have much else to go on. In terms of whether his Orientalism affected how he was perceived by Puritans around him, again, I don't think we have any evidence for that. I don't know if he was seen in some type of, mystical or mystified light in some way. Maybe Michael has something more to add to all of that.
Well, certainly not on the issue of anything mystical. There's, again, to go back to some of the scholarship on Monis's career at Harvard, his career there has been characterized as sort of unsatisfying and frustrating, and he never got paid enough and so on. There's some evidence to suggest that he was the target of harassment from students at a certain point. like at a certain point, there was some intercession on the part of some Harvard authorities who decided that, I forget what it was, that they were going to have him only do tutorials because it seemed that he was not good at classroom management or something to that effect. But in any case, there's evidence that he was harassed, and whether the harassment came about because he was a Jew by birth is a matter of speculation, but I've certainly seen people hint at that possibility. Who knows? Who knows?
He might have just been a horrible teacher.
Well, right. I think there is evidence that he was not a very good teacher. So if we're going to go with the evidence, then you know, that's the fate of certain teachers, I suppose. But certainly nothing that would trace back to his North African origins as being particularly significant there.
Okay, the next question. Would you rate his contribution to United States positive reception of Jews in general as significant?
I'll jump in and say that I'm going to try to address this question, not by talking specifically about Monus, but just to, I'll just extend from him to talk about colonial era Jews in general, and whether their status enhanced the status of Jews, later generations of Jews coming to North America. It's a complicated question, but I would say that on the whole, this has mostly to do with the fact that policies in the colony, trading policies in the colony, were much more tolerant of Jewish presence here. We're talking particularly through the 18th century. And so to the extent that the colonial authorities were more tolerant in North America and in the Caribbean than they were in Europe of Jews, then I suppose you could extrapolate from that and say, well, on that basis, later generations of Jews arriving in the Americas had the way paved for them. But it's a very complicated question. People have tried to argue, like most famously Max Weber, who said that there was a natural alliance between Protestants and Jews, and this is all going back to the Protestant work ethic. I think that's, in fact, I refer to that in New Israel, New England, as wishful thinking. I don't think that because New England Puritans loved the Hebrew Bible that they necessarily had any love for Portuguese Jewish merchants. I think in some cases, yes, but in some cases it didn't matter. So I guess I'm going to have to end by saying, no, I don't think so. And certainly Monus, I'm not sure that he would have paved the way for anybody, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he was, we would be hard pressed to make the case that he was paving the way, certainly, for anybody. But on the other hand, I do think that he was fitting himself into this role, into this caricature in some way, of actually playing the part of the Jew for his Protestant cohort, for the people that he was associated with. It's, as Michael said, he faced a lot of backlash in his teaching, but he was also at the same time referred to through the end of his life and beyond as Rabbi Judah Monis. And this is long after his conversion. And I mean, even again, to come back to Ezra Stiles, refers to him as a rabbi. He's seen by figures like Ezra Stiles, and then even some coming after Ezra Stiles, as a Jewish authority. And his texts and his readings, for example, of the Zohar, which I brought up, are seen as legitimate Jewish readings of these texts by these American Protestant figures. So whether he paved the way for Jews, I'm not sure, but he certainly played a role for his Protestant cohort.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm. The very last question that we have tonight, I can say it's tonight already. Does Moniz' grammar still hold up for teaching Hebrew?
Well, so it was replaced very quickly after him by a grammar written by his successor named Samuel Sewell. It's a pretty bad grammar if you read through it in terms of, it's not something I would use in a Hebrew class, I would say, certainly. I mean, it holds up as an important and interesting historical document, but as a grammar, it wouldn't be my first choice.
And is Sewell's, I've read about Sewell's and about the relationship between Sewell and Monus. Is Sewell's grammar better? Like,
in full disclosure, I've never looked at Sewell's grammar. I don't know. I've never had reason to look
I know
at
he
it.
claimed it was better. But yeah.
You can go to even 15th century, 16th century grammars that are way better than Monus's grammar. That, although the problem is, right, I guess, I don't know, we'd have to look at like Shalom Goldberg's book of, I don't know when the first English Hebrew grammar was published. It's what he was facing in terms of competition with that. But yeah, it's not I wouldn't use it in a Hebrew class. It's you can do much better. I'm sure there are more contemporary things that people use, that.
So let me just add that in case you would like to make use of his grammar, it is actually the book that Brian was referring to is actually digitized. So if you go to our website and if you search for it, you're going to find it and you will be able to see page by page the things and the questions that Brian was referring to. So please.
Yeah, but use it as an historical document. Don't use it to try to teach yourself Hebrew. You're better off, signing up for Duolingo or I don't know what else is out there than trying to look up, Metcalf's version of Judah Monis's grammar in order to teach yourself. That would be interesting, though. I wonder what would happen. I wonder how your Hebrew would come out in the end.
Definitely try to find better use of it and follow Brian's suggestions. But just FYI, it is digitized, so you can have access to it even before the building closes. Even before the building opens. I wanted to talk about the closing of our tonight's meeting, and it turns out that it moved me to closing and not opening of our actual building. As you can see, we don't need a building to have a fabulous, inspiring, and quite interesting and informative conversation. Thank you very much to Brian and Michael. This was very long and very informative. And I have learned a lot, and I believe that those attendees who stayed with us have too. As I said, our meeting is recorded, and you will have a chance to get back to it via our YouTube channel, possibly within a week or so. Thank you again for your attendance. Thank you again to the panelists. If you enjoyed and if you keep on enjoying our programs, please consider supporting Center for Jewish History. You can go to our website, CJH.org, and donate, especially that all of our programs, as you have noticed, all of our programs are free. So if you consider donating instead of paying a ticket, that would be highly appreciated. Please join us for the newsletter so that you are up to date with more programs to come. There are actually going to be at least 2 this month that you should definitely stay tuned to. So please check our programs on our website and sign up for our newsletter to be up to date. And on that note, I wish you all a great evening. Thank you again, and see you soon.
Thank you, Malgo. Thank you, Brian. And thank you to all of you attending. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much.
All, yes.
Good night.
Well.
Good night.